All right, so as it said in the email, as you all already know, this is going to be my quick overview of some historical arguments against free markets and against capitalism, and more importantly, some people who are smarter and more important than me, response to those arguments. So, first off, The Worldly Philosophers is one of the most popular econ textbooks. If you get an econ degree in this country, you probably take History of Economic Thought. This is required almost everywhere for that class. So this is the book, and I'll pass it around. You can take a look at the book and also Vroman's sometimes appropriate and sometimes just silly doodlings on the 6 economist pictures on the cover. So the original copyright in 1953, mine's from 1999. There's been several updates to it over the years. It's sold over 4 million copies, one of the best-selling econ books of all time, partially because it's really well written and covers a lot of interesting stuff, well, interesting depending on who you ask, and partially because it's required for a lot of these classes, but it's a hot seller. Robert Heilbronner, the author, is a socialist, openly socialist. That term doesn't have the same pejorative sense that it has among some of my friends in most of the general population, but take it for what it is, and therefore he's going to be, because he's a socialist, he's going to be opposed to free markets a lot. This being a popular book, you're going to get sort of more socialist and less free market education from it, if that's what you're interested in. If you want to know what the lean is, it's definitely that. Although it says, on Wikipedia at least, though an outspoken socialist for nearly his entire career, Heilbronner famously wrote in the 1989 New Yorker article, quote, "Less than 75 years after it officially began, the contest between capitalism and socialism is over. Capitalism has won. Capitalism organizes the material affairs of humankind more satisfactorily than socialism." Hey, that's something great. He also, in one of his introductions, he had to change I don't have all the details on this, but what I heard from one of my econ professors is that prior to the fall of the Berlin Wall, the book was still very, look, the proof is in the pudding. Communism is organizing the affairs of human society better than capitalism. They're keeping up with us. They're passing us. It's amazing. It's wonderful. Then the Berlin Wall falls, and we get all the real statistics, and we find out about all the starving people, and he had to revise it. And he even referred specifically to an Austrian economist, Ludwig von Mises, who was a vocal opponent of the idea of communism. He put forth the idea, the economic calculation problem, that without prices to guide how things are produced in society, that you can never have an efficiently organized system of production. Therefore, communism will inevitably fail. And as long as there's a market economy for them to kind of fake it by using their prices as sort of a means of organizing things, then they can maybe limp along. But once you lose prices, you lose all coordination, and it's a fundamental problem. Heilbronner, in his revision after the fall of the Berlin Wall, said something along the lines of, "The world was wrong and Mises right," which is a nice thing, especially because he more or less ignores the Austrian school of which Mises is a part in this book, which is supposed to be a history of economic thought. So here's some of the chapters. Just real quick, go over some of the big names. Adam Smith is the first person referenced. Adam Smith is the first person referenced in most history of economic thought classes. You might think he invented free markets, but really free markets predate Adam Smith by a lot. Yeah, do you have a question? Oh. So Adam Smith popularized the notion of specialization and trade as a means of producing wealth. And he also popularized the notion that money is not wealth. And I can talk about that more if anybody has any question about that. People want what we want. Money is a way to get what we want. Money, it doesn't stand in the way of getting what we want. It makes everything smoother. You work for money. You trade the money for the things you really want. That's one of the major purposes of money, is to hold value for you. You trade something valuable of yours that someone else wants. If you are a carpenter, you trade your time working on wood to someone else who wants wood that has been worked into a certain shape. They give you money, and then you take the money and you go buy food or whatever. So Adam Smith is one of the most prominent early proponents of that idea, and he gets all the credit, even though, as I'll say later, he doesn't necessarily deserve it. Parson Malthus is a reference to Thomas Malthus, who is actually the first person to hold the title professor of economics. He was more or less a contemporary of Adam Smith, came a little bit after that. He is associated with the idea of the Malthusian crisis, which I'll talk about more in a moment. David Ricardo is one of the most brilliant economists of all time. Given where economic thought was at the time that he was operating, David Friedman, the son of Milton Friedman, has made the analogy that to get where he got, It would be like going on an expedition up Everest, arriving at the top, and finding someone in jogging shorts and tennis shoes. He was so ill-equipped for the leaps that he made in economic thinking. And he's the one who came up with the idea that price is determined by the intersection of supply and demand. Before that, no one really knew where price came from. Adam Smith and others, even through the 19th century after Ricardo, were married to this idea of the labor theory of value, that value comes from people mixing their labor with something. When you work on something, that produces value. But as we know, you can work on something and produce no value. And there's a lot of history of that, especially with government programs. And then Karl Marx, who we'll go into in great detail later on, Thorstein Veblen, who I'll talk about, John Maynard Keynes, who was another, I'll go ahead and say enemy of free markets, although he would say that he liked markets and wanted to help them. And Joseph Schumpeter, who was an Austrian, but not an Austrian economist. He's not in the Austrian school. He's an economist from Austria. And we'll talk a little bit about him. Okay, so that's some of what it's about. All right. Prior to Adam Smith, Hobbes, this thinker, said, in the state of nature, man's life is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. And you think about someone living alone on an island, it sucks. You don't have the modern conveniences. You don't even have primitive conveniences. You have nothing. So you probably don't live very long because you get a disease very quickly. If you want the alternative to that kind of poverty, people have to work together. And the best way for people to work together is to specialize. The point is, in the world we have limited resources. And in the world we have people who have unlimited wants. Whatever you have, you could always use a little bit more. It would make everything a little bit easier if you had a little bit more. So the question is, how should things be arranged in society? And Adam Smith was the one who popularized this idea of specialization and trade. He gets all the credit for being the father of modern economics, even though he admits he stole the idea from the French physiocrats, who he was a tutor in France at the time that he was writing the Wealth of Nations, his famous book. And the physiocrats were the ones who were against the prevailing economic idea that wealth is money. And so the national policy pretty much everywhere was, we need to have an export surplus. We need to be exporting more than we're importing. That way we're getting more money than we're spending, and the nation will grow, our coffers will have more money. Adam Smith said, you don't really want money, you want stuff. And if you relax those kinds of restrictions on trade, you can accumulate more stuff and the people will be happier. The material wealth of the country will increase, and that's good. Okay, so we're all better off with free trade. That's a really quick cursory examination of the history of how we got to free trade. But what about declining wages? One of the first people to point out the problem of declining wages was Malthus in the Malthusian crisis. Malthus points out, so you got so much land, you can expand the amount of land that you have available, but not very much. And every additional piece of land that you use is going to be not as good as the last piece of land because of diminishing marginal returns. We're probably already using the best land when he wrote this in the late 17th century, or late 18th century. You're probably already using the best land, and when we expand to farming more land, you're farming less and less productively. And the land is expanding at an algebraic rate, 1, 2, 3, 4. That's how quickly we can expand the land. But populations grow geometrically. They double every certain number of years. The land is not doubling at that same rate, so we're going to quickly have a place where we're not producing enough food for the people. That's the Malthusian crisis, that you will have a population explosion, and you can either have, I can't remember which is which, he had this idea of positive and negative checks, where on the one hand you can use a government policy to control the price of food and to have like one child per family rules or something like that, restrict the rate at which people are reproducing. Or you can have, I think the other one was negative checks, famines, wars, something that will curb this incredible explosion of population and keep you from running out of food and space. Lassalle is a French dude who was active in the German Communist Revolution of 1848. He was a communist wandering around back then in the same circles as the people who were reading the stuff Marx and Engels were writing. He is associated with the term the iron law of wages. The iron law of wages states that if you have people going to work and they want to work, you've got an increasing population, more people vying for the same number of jobs, you're going to run out of wages available for people, plus they have no bargaining power. They'll work for as little as it takes for them to feed their family or just feed themselves if they have no family. So quickly their wages will approach subsistence. They can't work for less than subsistence or they'll just starve. So they have no bargaining power, and quickly they all go to subsistence wages, and then everybody's working for subsistence and people are starving because they can't get work. That's the iron law of wages, is that as population grows, wages are depressed, and lots of people starve. And Marx, of course, talked about worker exploitation, the idea that it's very closely tied to the iron law of wages and also the Malthusian crisis, that you have all of the non-owners of capital, they have no bargaining power, so they wind up getting whatever the owners will give them for wages. They can't work for less than subsistence because of the iron law, they'll just die if they do that. So they'll get whatever they can, and because of population growth, okay. And that's how we get ideas like right to work, lower wages, no benefits, we need unions so that we can fight for power. All right. But obviously that's not what happens. Here we are hundreds of years later, and everyone is not working for subsistence. Certainly no one in this room, almost no one in this country is working for subsistence, and most of them aren't in unions. So why do wages actually increase? The reason is employers are not a monopsony. A monopsony is a market where there's only one buyer. If there's only one buyer of something, they can dictate the price. But if there are multiple employers offering different levels of wages, then they have to compete with one another. One person says, I'll give you subsistence, another person says, I'll give you subsistence plus $10 a week. You're going to go to the guy who gives you subsistence plus $10 a week. And that goes along with the idea that employees and people are highly heterogeneous. They're different one to the next. Different people have different skills, and different skills at different levels. So you see employers competing for workers who are better at what they need them for. That's why we have corporate headhunters and things like that. People who go out and find the person who'd be the best person for the job, bring them in because, okay. The reason I have a picture of Ludwig von Mises here, one of the main people from the Austrian School of Economics, is because he was a firm advocate of the idea that the iron law of wages is total nonsense, and that the wages of any given worker in a sufficiently competitive environment for jobs, the wages of any worker will approach the marginal product of that worker's labor. So whatever your work is worth to the economy as a whole, to your employer, to the customers that they're ultimately selling it to, that's roughly what you'll wind up getting paid. So that's why I have a picture of him, because it's part of this marginal value theory, the idea that wages will not just plummet over time, wages will increase in a sufficiently competitive environment until workers are earning approximately the value of what they're producing. Okay, that's all fine. But what about resource overconsumption? We're going to run out of everything. Malthus talked about this in the Malthusian crisis. We're going to run out of land, we're going to run out of food. Marx talked about this in the capitalist imperialism concept. He was a firm believer that a capitalist society has to constantly be conquering countries to create new markets for their manufactured goods and to get new resource access. We've already mined all the resources in this country. Let's conquer that country so we can get their resources, bring them back home, manufacture them into finished goods, and then sell them back to the people at an increased rate. We're going to exploit these people like crazy. And Paul Ehrlich is a more contemporary thinker. He wrote a book called Population Bomb, I think it was called. It's straight up neo-Malthusianism, the idea that he looked at the numbers and, it looks like food is increasing at this rate, population is increasing at this rate. So by 1970, we're just going to have to figure out who's going to live and who's going to die. But obviously that did not really happen. And the reason that didn't happen, at least in the case of Ehrlich, is, I'll get to that. But real quick, here's a picture of Ehrlich. The Story of Stuff is a movie you can watch online where this group has made a semi-documentary that documents from resource extraction all the way to landfill how things move. And it's a very resource overconsumption myth touting thing. And if you want to get really angry, I suggest watching it. So why did we never run out of, say, copper? The reason we never ran out is because prices allocate resources. When something becomes scarce, it becomes expensive. As long as there are sufficiently robust property rights, the person who has the last bit of copper can name their price. They can sell it to the person who can make the absolute best use of it. And you can carry that on to someone who says, okay, I looked at it, we've only got 3 years of copper left, and I know that in 3 years the price of copper is going to go up to this much, or I predict that it's going to go up to this much. I'll start buying copper right now. That's going to make the price go up right now. People will start conserving right now, using less of it. So in 3 years, there's more left than people thought. And the price goes down 3 years from now. Goes up now, goes down in the future. That kind of, it's got a really bad association, but it's called speculation. market speculation. You think that the price of the thing is going to go up in the future, so you buy it right now, and if you were right, if the price did go up in the future, you make money. And the benefit to society is that you have forced people who were buying it on the open market to conserve in the present and then use it in the future. You are the clearinghouse, the savings bank for that resource. And that holds for all kinds of resources. So you need prices allocating resources and robust property rights. There's also, fortunately, the substitution effect. We didn't run out of copper because there are other things that conduct electricity that we could be using. We use silicon, we use gold to a lesser extent. There are alternatives. Even if you're going to be using copper, you can use less. TVs manufactured today use less copper than TVs manufactured 50 years ago because copper went up in price, or maybe the price stayed the same, but Magnavox figured out that if we want to make more money selling TVs, we should put some money into R&D and figure out a way to do the same thing with less. So companies always have that profit motive, and therefore they are the ones conserving resources. And so are people. If Magnavox figures out a way to use less copper, their TVs could be cheaper, and so people buy the Magnavox instead of buying the Panasonic or whatever. I'm not endorsing Magnavox or Panasonic. The point is, people use prices to determine what they buy in the market, and prices are a signal to them, on the one hand, very distant from their original source, of the scarcity of that resource. If copper becomes very expensive, anything produced with copper becomes very expensive, and you say, I'll put off buying it until next year, I don't really need that. And then there's less copper used up in the economy. So prices allocate resources. There's a lot of people concerned about peak oil. I'm not worried about it because there's a great video with Stephen Horwitz. He's an excellent economist. It's a great video where he talks about peak oil and other resource scarcity concerns, where he talks about how we have all of these things. We have the substitution effect. We have prices allocating resources. But people still say, well, we've only got 10 years left of proven reserves of petroleum. But if you look historically, the amount of proven reserves tends to go up. So that we always have 10 or 20 years of proven reserves, even though the rate at which we're using it is increasing dramatically. How can that possibly be? There's only so much oil in the earth, right? Well, the answer is, we don't really know how much oil is in the earth because we're not really looking for it. We are looking in the places where it's easiest to find. But there are a lot of other places where we're not necessarily looking, and those are the places we'll be getting it in the future when the price goes up, or when we find cheaper ways to get it from those difficult places. And improved extraction techniques and additional searches are what are a major driver of reduced resource costs going into the future. So I'm not worried about peak oil for that reason, although there are perhaps other reasons to worry about it. David Friedman has an excellent blog post about this where he says that if property rights are not sufficiently robust, and if we have price controls, then two of these important things are not working like they're supposed to, and we may actually encounter a problem, but that is not a free market problem. Yeah?
Yeah, they tried price controls back in the 70s.
You get
a lot of
locks.
things that we got shortages
Right.
and
You get
gas
locks.
lines and stuff
Yeah.
like that.
When prices do not allocate resources, then so one of the points of having a free market is that when you have different price points, or when you have a certain price point, the people who need it the most are the people who are going to buy it first. The people who need it less, when the price goes up, say, no, they're the first ones to be disinclined from buying it. And so things are allocated most efficiently when you allow prices to move as they should. When you artificially depress prices, like you say, oh no, that's price gouging, you can't sell gas for more than $2 a gallon, or back then I'm sure it was 10 cents a gallon or whatever, then that encourages people who would otherwise decide not to drive. They drive a little bit more, and they go and they get in line, and maybe the apples don't get delivered that week because the truck couldn't get early enough in line, whatever. So we're not really running out of resources, but what about recessions? Oh no. Marx talked about cyclical depressions, this idea that naturally you have sometimes where there's, the economy's moving smoothly, and sometimes it slows down. When it slows down, that's when some of the owners, they lose their shirts, they go out of business. The other owners, since they've got capital available and they're weathering the crisis, they buy up what the owners had, and you get increased concentration of power. That was one of Marx's concerns with the idea of cyclical depressions. And of course, every time there's a depression, more people starving. That's Marx's view of things. And Keynes had the general theory, which he came out with during the early on in the really bad and really long global depression. And Keynes said, look, there's various things that are causing this to happen, and the way out is increased government spending for the for the short term, increase government spending, and we can buy our way out of it. It's going to be okay. Well, I'm going to take a different approach, which is how do we even prevent these? And I will give a real quick version of Austrian Business Cycle Theory, which is not accepted by everyone, but I like it. Maybe you will too. The interest rate is the price of money. What that means is someone has $1,000 and they would like to have more money in the future. They don't really need it right now. They want to put it into savings. If there is no such thing as a bank, what do you do with your $1,000? You wander around town looking for somebody who wants to make some improvements on his house today and will pay you with the original money plus a little more in the future, right? This is the origin of credit. People who have money now but will need more money in the future versus people who need money now and will have additional money in the future. Part of the reason why the people spending money now can expect to have more in the future is they can make improvements to their business or to their circumstance. They can buy additional equipment. They can expand their business, etc. So the interest rate is the price of money because it's the interaction of supply and demand. You have the supply of credit at various interest rates. You have the demand for credit at various interest rates. And different quantities of money, interest rates, they come together and you get a certain market rate of interest. When you fiddle with that, you mess up the signal. The signal there is, I have this money now, I'm letting you borrow it right now for some amount of time, and in the future, I need it back because I want to spend it, maybe for retirement. I expect to be spending a certain amount in my retirement, I'm saving it now, I'm investing it, and in my retirement, I'll be spending it. So when the supply of credit goes up, when more people are saving money, that is a signal to the market that more money is going to be spent in the future, that there will be more money available because these investments are being made and more people are planning to spend it in the future. When the supply of credit goes up artificially, it sends a signal to the market that is, the supply of credit would be a lower interest rate. When you can get a loan cheaper with a lower interest rate, you're more likely to take out a loan. When the supply of credit goes up artificially, you take out additional loans, you expand your business, and then in 10 years, the people that you thought would be retiring and spending money aren't, because that interest rate was lowered artificially. It was lowered artificially through monetary policy or through fiscal policy, through government intervention in the economy. They can lower the interest rate by changing the rules for banks, how much they can have on hand versus how much they can lend out with checking accounts. They can change the rules by having the Federal Reserve print more money and just put it in the hands of banks. Banks are lending it out, but no one is actually saving that money and preparing to spend in the future. So the Austrian theory is government meddling in fiscal policy and changing the rate of interest is the cause of the business cycle. The reason why there are booms and busts. The booms are, suddenly there's this money available, let's all spend it. The bust is, oh wait, no one's buying our goods that we expanded our business in order to sell. That's the boom and the bust. That's what Mises was talking about, that's what Hayek was talking about, and there's an excellent lecture by Murray Rothbard that we see here that talks about all this. And the real problem is when the bill comes due. You pay back the loan, but nobody comes in to buy. And so you have to close your doors or you can't finish this project. Mises talked about it as a signal to the economy to build things that no one really wants. No one really wants those things, but you build them because you think that they do, and then you don't find out until you're deep into the project that that economic demand isn't actually there. And so that's how we get the business cycle, according to the Austrians, that government intervention in monetary policy and fiscal policy is the real reason for business cycle theory, and that depressions wouldn't be a problem if not for those interventions, which is the exact opposite of what Keynes says. And if they're right, then if the Austrians are right and politicians are listening to the Keynesians, then we're going to see increased cycles with increased severity going forward. And lo and behold, that does seem to be happening. What about poisoning customers? Businesses are going to poison their customers. Why wouldn't they? It's easier to not worry about the amount of lead and sawdust and bug parts going into your food. So you bake bread and you sell it, whatever. They're going to come and buy it. They're going to buy it. One of the people who talked about this was Upton Sinclair in his fictional novel, The Jungle, which he did like 6 years of research in Chicago as a meat packer. And he published this book, and it's supposed to be just a novel, telling a story, but everybody was like, what? What are they doing in Chicago? They're putting what in the meat? And these concerns are legitimate. It is very good that people find out what they're putting in the meat. Also, the general exploitation of customers by businesses is a very Marxian idea. The idea that the people who own capital, they have all the power. The workers and the customers have none of the power, they have no bargaining power, so whatever the businesses deign to sell them, that is what the people will be buying. I say competition is the cure. I have a picture of Thomas Sowell, who's one of my favorite economics writers. He's an economist, and one of the things he talks about is that you won't actually get poisoning customers because of competition. If only one business sells poisoned food, they lose market share. Nobody wants to buy from the poison place. Everybody buys everywhere else. If all businesses sell poisoned food, there's a profit opportunity. Time to rent some space and buy some clean food and start selling it. It'll fly off the shelves. And the rest of the businesses will find that they're in the position of the poisoners and start losing market share. It's a problem if there is fraud, if people are lying about what's in the food, but we already have mechanisms to punish people who are engaging in fraud. If you lie to your customers, you get in trouble already. I'm not against punishing fraudulent people, and I think that that's a crucial element of the free market, is that there is something bad that happens to people who engage in fraud. Yeah.
What would be the mechanism, though? Because as I understand, you're an anarcho-capitalist. So
Yeah.
what would be the mechanism of
For, for the time being, I'm just going to stick with government because it's a lot easier argument to make because everyone else in the room is not an anarchist. So I will just say that we have the government, they will punish the fraudulent, and we're better off for it. This gets to the definition of demand. No, so economists distinguish between demand and want. You can want something without demanding it. I would like a PlayStation 3, but I don't demand it because I don't own one. I am not willing to give up all the other things that I'm spending money on to get a PlayStation 3. And we all want things that we don't demand. You only demand something that you are willing to buy and able to buy. So, in the case of poisoned food, if you think back to like the 12th and 13th centuries, people were eating some pretty gross stuff. They had no alternative. They couldn't afford better things because there wasn't enough wealth in society for everyone to just eat really nice food all the time, like we can in this country right now. You couldn't just get clean food at every meal. You were eating a lot of dirt in your gruel. So they didn't demand clean food. As societal wealth increases, the demand for clean food goes up. Once people demand clean food and there is punishment for fraud, you get clean food on the shelves. So it gets to the definition of demand, and it doesn't just apply to poison food. It applies to any aspect of a product where a company might cut corners on quality, but then they're selling to people who are willing to buy the ones who are cutting corners on quality. And I'll go ahead and say it. When I buy the Walmart backpack instead of the high-end $200 backpack, I know it's going to fall apart in 2 years, but it's worth it to me because I save that money. It's lower quality, but it serves my needs. I don't demand the superior, buy-it-for-life, excellent backpack. So the definition of demand plays into how competition is the cure for poisoned food and other cutting corners. What about plutocracy? What about the problem of the rule by the wealthy, the rule by the elite? This is crucial to everything Marx stood for, that you're going to get a rule by the wealthy elite and everyone else is going to be exploited to their own detriment and to their deaths, perhaps. John Stuart Mill did not explicitly write about this, to my knowledge, but he wrote a book called Utilitarianism, which is one of the first one of the first pieces that really was prominent and advocated for let's all share. Later people would play off of his ideas to advocate for things like the welfare state. Let's tax the rich and feed the poor. So let's say that he was afraid of the idea of plutocracy, even though, as far as I know, he didn't explicitly say, the wealthy are going to run everything, they're going to run us all into the ground. So what do we do about this? This is a seriously tough problem, and I don't necessarily know the answer. What I will say is, no system in history has sufficiently solved the problem of getting rid of rule by the wealthy and the elite. In fact, I think that the people who complain about it in our current society have legitimate complaints. People who complain about it anywhere in the world, now or in history, have legitimate complaints. And the two pictures here are the Oneida community, which was a free love commune in the late 19th century. They make silverware. You may have seen that. And actually, they play heavily into the story of the assassination of President Garfield. Charles Guiteau. Anyway, that's not important, but they didn't do it. This guy who was in and out, the Oneida community did do it. So the Oneida community is an example of a commune where they tried to solve the problem of rule by the elite. You have your own little small area and it's a society of equals. Monks have done the same thing for a very long time. They all take an oath of poverty. None of them can own anything, and they're all equal. right? Like they make decisions communally, and yeah.
Well, they also take, in most cases, an oath of obedience.
They take an oath of obedience to the church, right?
Right.
So they answer to an authority, but especially in the Middle Ages, monasteries were not very tightly overseen by the churches far away. They were just kind of farming and praying, and that's what they did. So one way to get around the really tough problem of rule by the wealthy and rule by the elite is everybody agrees to live in poverty, and then we don't have to worry about it. But if you want to have wealth and have an increasing standard of living, you're going to have to arrange society such that some people are going to have something over someone else. There's because of the incredible heterogeneity of human beings, different people are different. If people are being paid for their work, which is what we hope for in a free market, if you get as we talked about, the marginal value of your work is the marginal return, the money that you get paid for it, then some people are going to produce things that are more valuable to society than other people. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. So we have to go with the best of bad alternatives if we want to fight plutocracy. And maybe the kind of democracy that we have, or the kind of republic that was set up by the founding fathers is a really good answer to that. Yeah?
Well, it also has to go more into like competition too, of income mobility. Like if I have the opportunity to be one of the elite.
So we hope that that's true.
Yeah.
We hope that there is the possibility of moving on the income ladder, and that's probably true. I say that the best way to fight rule by the elite and the wealthy is to remove as much power from government as you can. The less the government is doing, the less people can buy from it. So that's my contention, but it's a really tough problem. You can't completely get rid of it. You just have to deal with the best of the bad alternatives. So that's unfortunate. But what about?
Well, I was going to say, like, there are also these plutocracies are inherently unstable. Like you go back to Rome in the first triumvirate, you had the most powerful men in Rome align with themselves, and then they ruled for a little while, but then they broke apart.
So maybe that's true.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I don't address in any of these slides is the problem of cartels, which economically are inherently unstable. They need enforcement mechanisms to keep the members from cheating, which, for example, the members of OPEC cheat all the time. As soon as they all agree to sell for $90 a barrel and they actually get them for $70 a barrel, there's an incentive for all of them to sell as many as they can, out the door cheaper, and get otherwise they're just sitting in a stockpile. What good is that to them? They want the money. Okay, and there may be a similar kind of negative check on plutocracy, but it's a real problem. It's existed for all of time, and I don't know how to directly deal with it. But pollution's a serious problem, right? Free market, you'll just get crazy pollution. Everybody's gonna get cancer or something. Aaron Brockovich and all these terrible things. Okay, pollution is one part of a class of problems called externalities. There are positive and negative externalities. An externality is any effect that happens on someone who wasn't directly involved in a transaction. So I buy power from Ameren. Ameren has coal plants. These coal plants are polluting. People who live near the coal plants get sick. They didn't want that to happen, but they weren't asked. They would like to send Ameren a bill, but there's too many of them for them to get together. We have class action lawsuits, but they're not necessarily the most efficient method for solving this problem. Externality problems are most efficiently solved when transaction costs are low. What that means is the cost of getting together and exchanging information. In other words, if it's really hard to coordinate all the people who are being harmed by something and have them pay to stop the harm, then probably the harm is going to continue. And that's sad, but the alternative is something that's even less efficient. And people will say, oh, free market is all they care about is efficiency. There's more important things in the world. And I say, absolutely, it's true. Some people would say that there are more important things in the world than efficiency. For example, those monks on the previous slide feel that prayer and farming is more important than efficiency, that sharing and taking an oath of poverty. But most people would rather improve their material well-being and worry about the other stuff later. And I think that's a good thing for people's material well-being to be improved. There's billions of starving people all over the world, and they would really like access to some of this material well-being that we've got going on in the first world. So let's get it to them. Let's worry about efficiency until we've solved all the other problems. So efficiency is important because efficiency determines the total bundle of material goods that we have, and it matters. One of the reasons that I like the free market versus governments is because governments aren't omniscient. Even when dealing with pollution, they don't know everything. They don't know what the total quantity of the harm is. They don't know where all the harm is going. And there are a couple of solutions to the problem of pollution. Pigouvian taxes and cap and trade are kind of the two big types. Pigouvian taxes are for every ton of carbon that you put out in the atmosphere, people are going to suffer $1 of harm, so we'll tax you $1 for every ton of carbon that you pollute. Well, who says a ton causes $1 of harm, and to who? And who are you going to pay that dollar to? The people that are harmed? How do you find them? The problem with having a marginal tax like that on marginal pollution rates is that nobody really knows what the marginal damage is, so it's really hard to calculate. And I would rather leave it up to the market to solve that. The other side is cap and trade, which is the socially optimal amount of pollution is 200 tons for each factory. So we don't want more than 200 tons per factory. Everybody gets a 200-ton voucher, and you can trade them so that there's only 200 tons per factory going out, and then everything's going to be okay. Who says the socially optimal amount is 200 tons per factory? It's going to be a government official somewhere, and I'm really worried about things like regulatory capture, where the people who used to work at the factory are now working at the government agency that controls the factories, and they're giving handouts to their friends. Okay, the free market will solve it better than concentrating the power to affect people's lives and control this pollution into the government. Okay, so it's not great, but what about market waste?
What's that?
That's a picture of Ronald Coase, who came up with this thing called Coase theorem, which deals with one way that externalities might be solved, and it tells us that transaction costs are very important. He's a Chicago school economist from the 20th century. Market waste. When people buy things they shouldn't, or fail to buy things they should, and or when companies produce things that they shouldn't, or fail to produce things that they should. So I know what people are buying all this stuff, they don't need it, I know what people should be buying. Or companies, they're making all this stuff, it's such a waste, they should be making this instead. Or, all right. Some of the people who've advocated ideas like this include our old friend Marx, who's on almost every page. In Assorted Writings, he said more or less that the people who are in charge, the capitalists, they control it, they get to dictate terms, and they're not really making what the people want or need, they're making what they want to sell to the people, what's best for, what's in their interests. Well, what we've seen from previous slides is that that's not necessarily true, but some of the other people. Thorstein Veblen, that's this dude over here. He wrote something called The Theory of the Leisure Class, which was one of the early pieces that talked about conspicuous consumption. I believe he coined the term. The idea that people would buy something not because of the economic value of that good to them. They buy a watch. For example, here's Che Guevara wearing a Rolex. They buy a watch not because it's worth it to them to spend $10 or $20 to have a watch that works and that tells them the time. They buy a Rolex for $500 or more because they want to tell everyone, hey, I can afford a Rolex, okay? I'm pretty cool. And that's what Che Guevara was after, right? He wanted to look cool. And then there's Keynes's general theory, which also talks about the idea that companies aren't producing what they should, and people aren't buying when they should. These things that are not coordinated properly, the market's not really working. And some examples of prominent opponents of the idea that markets will produce the right things are Stalin, Mao, and Che Guevara with his Rolex. I say, on the one hand, these are normative criticisms. You are saying people buy the wrong things. Well, who says? Why should we listen to you when you say people buy the wrong things? I mean, it's well established that people would rather go see, not to pick on Transformers, but Transformers than Shakespeare. And maybe that's lamentable, but what are you going to do about it? You can go out and tell your friends, you should really enjoy this high culture instead of explosions. But explosions can be fun too, right? I mean, people will go for what they want. Economists differentiate between positive statements and normative statements. Positive statements are statements of fact. Normative statements are statements of opinion. It is normative to say that supply and demand, the interaction of supply and demand determines price. It is normative to say, this gas is too expensive. These are normative criticisms. People buy the wrong things. Businesses produce the wrong things. If your contention is instead that businesses are producing thing X or quantity X, when they should be producing thing Y or quantity Y, because that is what people actually want and businesses just aren't producing it, I offer a couple solutions. One, go into business. Start selling people the thing that they actually want. If you're right, they'll buy it, you'll make a mint, put the other guy out of business. That's how it's supposed to work. If you say, well, I can't go into business because there are all these reasons why a person trying to compete with the existing business can't really get into the market, I say that is a problem. That is a problem. As long as prices aren't dictating how resources are used and conserved, then, and as long as prices aren't a sufficient signal from buyers to producers of what people actually want, something is broken, and either you solve it by entering the market, or it might be a government problem. And I would say that by and large in the world today, they tend to be government problems. So the question is, where should this planning happen? Should what is produced be planned by the government? Should it be planned by the state? Should it be planned globally? Should it be planned by just people interacting? Friedrich August von Hayek, the last big name in the Austrian school that I have not yet touched on, felt that the fundamental problem of economics was the scarcity of knowledge and information. That knowledge and information were the ultimate resource. Well, I won't get into the ultimate resource, that's Julian Simon's book, and I skipped over him earlier. But if information can be got cheaply, quickly, efficiently, then markets will be as efficient as they could possibly be. Everyone will be producing what they're supposed to. But as long as information is expensive, you need to deal with that fact. And one way to deal with that fact is by allowing people to work locally rather than at a great distance. As long as they're working at a great distance, they're less likely to know the local situation, the local circumstances. This is why nationally planned things tend to fail. They don't know the local circumstances and what works best. More local planning means it can utilize more local knowledge. So that's Hayek, and I highly, highly recommend for anyone who hasn't read it, his short paper, The Use of Knowledge of Society from 1945. It talks about this in depth, and it's really, really good. Okay, so any questions? What did I miss? And even if I talked a little bit about something that you think is a concern, I can go into more detail. This stuff is worth covering multiple times. And I'm like 13 minutes to go, so any questions?
What would you say to the contention that free markets kind of impose this first world, third world kind of dichotomy?
So, similar to how life in the state of nature is nasty, poor, brutish, and short, solitary, nasty, poor, brutish, and short, we have the world that's around us, right? We have to face the world as it is. We can't just snap our fingers and make it be the way that we want. So, right now it is the case that some areas and some people are far better off than other areas and other people. And I propose that the way to fix that is to allow people to trade. That poverty is a natural state of existence, and wealth can be gained through specialization in trade. Just like Adam Smith said, and he wasn't wrong. And that the more you have protection for property rights, protection against fraud, and low barriers to trade, the faster you can grow wealth. And I would say, most importantly, equalize wealth. That the less wealthy countries will catch up to the more wealthy countries more quickly when you reduce the barriers to trade. And it takes a lot of price theory to really back up that kind of answer, but I think there's a good case to be made for it.
So, I have a question that you or someone would probably face on a radio show if you were a guest and delivering this kind of information. Are you saying then that in 2008, when the market collapsed and everything started to go south, that the bailout was exactly the wrong idea?
Absolutely. Hayek, for one.
Two bailouts, really, because you had Bush's bailout and you had Obama's bailout.
And you had bailing out in specific sectors. I would say that it's exactly the wrong thing to do, specifically because, as Hayek was frequently pointing out, you can't have a profit and loss system if there's no loss. There has to be a signal to producers when they are producing something that is not increasing the total amount of material goods that we have in society. There has to be a signal to them to say, hey, stop it. We don't need any more of that. We don't need any more houses. We don't need any more, let's say, American cars. Maybe we're not the best at making cars and we should let other people make them. Let the American car manufacturers go out of business. Let those people go do other jobs because there are other jobs to be done. And it sounds, it's hard to not make it sound cruel to say, I think those businesses should go out of business. I think those workers should be thrown out of work. But I would much rather have them, as soon as possible, finding something that will improve society rather than delaying the inevitable or putting them on a permanent government salary or something like that, where they never work to improve society like the people who are working in the free market, who weren't working in bailed out sectors.
So then the obvious follow-up question is, you just postpone the inevitable. You're imposing through government fiat, you're bailing out industries that should be allowed to fail on their own. So the follow-up is then that they're going to fail anyway, why extend their lifespan?
Yes. Yeah. That's. I would say.
So a crash is still coming. The crash.
Right.
Yeah.
Isn't that the
Yes.
logical?
Yes.
I would answer a couple ways. That, first of all, the various government tools it has it might not be able to prevent the inevitable, but it can slow down the inevitable, make it last much longer, occur much more slowly, much more in the time frame of the politicians who are making the choices, for whom their time frame is worrying about the next year to 4 years.
They're kicking the can down the road.
And if it happens over time, it might reduce the harm of it, meaning that people in the car industry, if it's saved right now, half the employees might voluntarily switch to other industries before that collapse. Newer people might go into it, so the effects of a crash can be mitigated perhaps.
So there's also the hope that you're buying time to try and reinvent the economy, or reinvent or come up with a different solution to transfigure yourself from, say, the farming society to the industrial society.
I have a
from
lot of
industrial
faith.
society
I have a
to
lot of
liberal
faith
society.
in workers to seek jobs and in entrepreneurs to seek profit opportunities. And I think that they will, as soon as things hit the fan, work to get themselves into a situation where they're not.
That's assuming a lot too. I mean, these are people who could just immediately lose their job. And then they're in a situation where, what do? I think maybe 60 years old or whatever, and have lost everything. And are you saying that the system is not going to help anybody? How are these people going to be helped? Do we have a social role to help?
So
others in society?
I think that we do have a social role, but I don't think it's a government role. I think that it is incumbent upon everyone in a free society to help out their neighbor. I think it is very good for people to have the impulse to help people who are in need, and especially when they're in a situation of very temporary need. I'm between jobs right now. I need to get back on my feet.
So how would you promote that so that it is in another individual's interest to help his neighbor?
Well, I am fully aware of the tendency of people to have the I already gave it the office attitude, and I think that, as bad as it sounds, I trust the people more than I trust the government. So I think it's far better for us to eliminate the government social safety net and let the people help each other.
Well, two things. One, I'm fully on board with the auto bailout was inexcusable. My only concern is, and that's why I'm kind of willing to give people the benefit of the doubt on TARP, was that you had not one company or several companies. You basically had systemic, and every financial company, which was tied basically to because you said people they put all their money there, and then it all collapses. And so even good actors didn't do anything.
I'm not saying that there was ever a chance that TARP would not happen. TARP was going to happen. Part of the reason it was going to happen is because of the implicit promise from the government that if things hit the fan, we will prop you up, we will save you. And it's a shame when you're the one who fails 6 months before everyone else, because then you just go out of business. When everyone else fails at the same time, we better get a TARP going. When the companies understand that their large systemic risks will be bailed out, they are perversely incentivized to take large systemic risks.
Right.
They make more money in the short term, and then when they get bailed out, they make more money in the long term. They have no reason not to. They get to gamble very dangerously with the taxpayer money and win no matter what. Heads I win, tails I win.
Well, yeah, and so since that moral hazard exists, how do we walk them back from that? Because they basically know that no matter what now, there's a systemic risk that we're going to get bailed out. So
Right.
how do you how do you short circuit that problem?
This is the kind of political problem that I don't know directly how to solve. But I know
Isn't that heartless?
theoretically what it would take is to have a federal government that is willing to say openly and be bound to the promise to never bail out companies ever again under any circumstances. When that happens, the companies taking systemic risk will stop their bad behavior immediately because they don't want to lose money.
But you can also say that the reason we have the bust is because, as you said earlier, we have the boom, and the boom happens because of government intervention.
Yes.
So when we see these problems, they're not, you said something about being heartless. What's heartless is to create a system where we continually make this type of thing happen by government intervention.
Give the implicit promises in the first hand that the prosperity will continue forever.
Right.
I'm going to dispute that the boom always occurs because of government intervention. There's lots of booms that occur due to technological
That's true.
advancement.
No, you're right.
Booms that occur due to gold strikes
So I guess
or silver strikes in the 1800s.
That is, yes, innovation and resource windfall, those absolutely cause economic booms. But there is no corresponding bust to booms like that because prices adjust very quickly. When a boom is caused by the government suddenly promising food to every person or suddenly promising housing to every person, then you get a bust. So
Yeah, that's why.
So
Isn't a lot of this just tied to just dramatic increases in the money supply? Whether, depending on how that's going to be inflation or you get a lot of gold, silver,
that changes the interest rate signal to investors.
Mm-hmm.
That changes the interest rate signal so that people invest. They suddenly see that money is cheap, so they borrow money, and then they think there will be more customers in the future. More people are saving, but they're not actually saving. So yes, that creates a false signal. Any government behavior that creates a false price signal, there's going to be a payback. There's going to be some kind of bounce back. Something in the market will suddenly say, oh, that's not working out the way that we thought. But they won't necessarily attribute it to its actual cause, and so instead you have politicians saying, well, we won't own up to the fact that we caused this, but we can fix it. So it is true. Not all economic booms are caused by bad government behavior. But booms that are followed by busts are.
So what was the bust with the government intervention for like the .com bubble? Because I can see how like companies, everybody had irrational exuberance, and anything with the .com after saying they threw money at it, they had no value, it busts. But but the market would react to that because people were misappropriating resources and they suffered losses, and then.
So the losses are contained. It is not an economy-wide problem. People who bought something that wasn't worth what they thought lose money. That happens every day. That happens all the time. When it happens across an entire sector, it might be because people have a really bad idea about that thing, but it is localized to that sector, and it doesn't spread across the entire economy.
Yeah, but the recession of that period was a fairly mild recession,
Yeah,
and it would be
that's what I
hard to
was
call
gonna
it
say,
a bust.
Any other questions?
Has anyone watched the Econ Stories rap videos?
Of course. Yes, big
Those
fan.
are excellent.
I almost called this Prepare to Get Schooled in My Austrian Perspective, which is the Hayek line.
I recommend
Because
watching.
Heilbronner does not talk enough about the Austrians. They got a lot of really good ideas, and I don't think they get enough play.
I'm sorry. I was just going to say for the pollution one, wouldn't the ideal solution be people would be incentivized to create an energy resource that didn't pollute, and then
So there is
Yeah.
one problem with externalities is that they don't create a sufficient incentive to innovate your way out of the dirty production method. That if you are a producer with a coal plant, you want to make electricity and sell it to someone, you don't have a sufficient incentive because you're not facing all the costs of your pollution. If information is cheap enough, if transaction costs are low enough, then you will, and then you'll innovate.
Could you shift in like the tax structure and say if you reduce carbon output or whatever by a certain percentage, you get a certain percentage decrease in taxes? And
You could. There are various tax
It's
policies
like
that you could use to try to account for the damage caused by pollution. It is my contention, and I think it's a good free market argument, that is going to decrease overall wealth in society. Either you're not going to hit it close enough, it's going to be too low and not sufficiently incentivize them to change. It's going to be too high, and they're going to be punished for their behavior. So I trust the market to come up with something, especially because every time you have an externality, that creates a profit opportunity. When people are being harmed by pollution because someone is polluting and not facing the costs, someone who can come up with a way for them to get what they are owed and get a piece of their own. I guess tort lawyers would be the main example here, but it's as long as they are working in a way that will equalize the damage done on the one hand and the gains by the company for doing the pollution on the other, then they're doing a good market service.
Yeah, I think with pollution, something that has to be talked about is just the tragedy of the commons as well.
Yes.
There are no property rights in the things that are experiencing pollution.
Yes. There's,
So of
you
course-
know when you're trespassing on someone's land, but you don't necessarily know when the smoke from your car is trespassing into their lungs. And that's a problem, and maybe it'll be solved sometime in the future, but right now we have what we have. Any other questions? I think I'm out of time. Thank you, everyone.